If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn in it to Jeremiah chapter 17. This is where we're going to spend our time. There are a lot of parallels between our time and the time in which Jesus' advent took place in Judea. And his advent comes at a really specific time in Jewish history. This wasn't, to see all of the elements that God arranged in Judea and in the Roman Empire at that time, it's remarkable. But there are very many parallels between that time and the time in which we are right now in this culture. And so I want to look at that today. Let's take a look at Jeremiah chapter 17. I'll begin reading in verse 5. The Lord says, I will put a curse on people who trust in mere human beings, who depend on flesh and blood for their strength, whose hearts have turned away from the Lord. They will be like a shrub in the desert. They will not experience good things when those good things happen. It will be as though they were growing in the desert, in a salt land where no one can live. My blessing is on those people who trust in me, who put their confidence in me. They will be like a tree planted near a stream, whose roots spread toward the water. The tree has nothing to fear when the heat comes. The tree's leaves are always green. It has no need to be concerned in the year of drought, and it doesn't stop bearing fruit. The human mind is more deceitful than anything else. It is incurably bad. Who can understand it? Now, obviously, there are some parallels here, and I want to comment on some of those parallels that we see in Judea at the time of the Advent and compared with our time today. There are huge parallels. For instance, when Jeremiah talks here of a root springing out of dry ground, that the gospel itself, that the Advent came in dry ground, there's a truth to that. And the truth is the same as it is for us. All right, in Judea at this time in history, things had become very secular, believe it or not. And this is even for the Jewish intelligentsia. And yet they maintained, just like us, the sentimentality of the festivals, the Jewish feasts that everybody came in to attend, especially the Passover, especially all the feasts that were the big ones in their minds. They came and they enjoyed all of the sentimental aspects of those feasts. But for most people, it was kind of just something they did. It was something fun. It became something as a part of their culture, but not as part of anything more significant than that. Very similar to us. Now, I'm not saying that the sentimental aspects of the Christmas season, the Advent season, are bad. I think they're good. I think God uses them. Matter of fact, some of you who like history will know this story. It's a true story. In World War I, you won't remember it because none of us were alive, but you know the story. In World War I, it was trench warfare. First time, the war in World War I was so much different from every war that had ever been fought before until it was called the War to End All Warfare. That's what people thought. They said, we could never go back to war because look at what we're doing here. They fought in trenches. And of course, we did go back to war not 20 years later. They fought in trenches. And these trenches would be separated by a football field or less. You could hear people in the trenches talking. And like in the old days of warfare, when it got dark, they quit, which is just weird to me. They just stopped fighting. Yeah, time to go to bed. Okay, time to lay down. We're going to stop shooting now. And they did. Well, this was Christmas Eve. And on this Christmas Eve, the Allied trenches, those who spoke English for the most part, heard songs coming from the German trenches that they recognized, O Tannenbaum and Silent Night, like we just did. And they thought, wow. So they started singing the hymns in English. And they heard each other. Well, suddenly a German soldier, this is dark now, you have to realize that got up on the top of the trench, which was stupid. I mean, you didn't come out of the trench because you just are an instant target. You know, you might as well be a paper target up there just a little way away. Singing, he was still singing. An American soldier looked up, or a British or an Allied, and said, wow. So he got up. And pretty soon they were gathered in between the trenches, and they were exchanging gifts, and they were singing carols. So for one night, World War I stopped for this group of soldiers completely. Why? But the sentimental aspects of all that surround the Advent. All of a sudden it became real for them. And warfare seemed ridiculous all of a sudden. That's really meaningful. You know, God uses that in people's lives today. There are lots of people who would never come to a church service, but they'll come on Christmas. We used to laughingly refer to the people who come at Christmas and Easter, the lilies and the hollies that would show up, you know, for those services. And no other time of the year, but God uses it. There are people who get born again because they showed up at a Christmas service and heard the gospel. But for some reason, this is so interesting to me culturally, this time of the year, for most people, becomes one of the driest times of the year emotionally for everybody. There are more tragedies at this time of the year. There are more suicides at this time of the year than any other time of the year. Why is that? I'm going to say it's because the year's memorial has become secular. Advent has become a secular holiday. It's just like Halloween for some. I have a friend who's a Christian who likes Halloween more than he likes Christmas. Just because it's funner for him. And all of the secular stuff, the pressures, think about the pressures. What are we going to fix for the family when they come? What are we going to get Uncle Louie for Christmas and Aunt Joanne? And who are we going to buy for all the children? And all of the list of people that we've got to shop for and do things for. And it just becomes a feverish attempt to make things right for somebody else, all because of Christmas. And we're just human beings, and our minds begin to blame the Advent season for all these pressures. I hate Christmas. Right? Ever heard somebody say that? I hate Christmas time. Look at all the stuff we got to do. Oh, it was no different in Judea. No different. It's no accident, by the way, in a supernatural sense, that all of these forces are marshaled against what the Advent is in our culture. That is no accident at all. There's an enemy who does not want anybody to recognize what the Advent is for, what it means, what caused us to even celebrate this time of the year. And think about this. How is it that some people can come to services, say Christmas carol singing services, and sing songs like we just did, with all the words that are in these songs, and leave the room unchanged when it's all over and just go about their business? For this all to become real, something supernatural has to take place. That's all there is to it. So it should come as no surprise that there would be a lot of forces marshaled against that supernatural event taking place in somebody's heart at this time of the year. That somebody might actually come to a service and suddenly see their lostness before God. So the incarnation comes at the Advent, and in some ways the incarnation comes to you and me afresh, hopefully at the Advent. Hopefully this time of the year does something in us where the incarnate Spirit of God in us changes us in some way. But you know, the human heart, Paul says, is not inclined toward God at all. As a matter of fact, Paul says we're at war with God as human beings. Romans chapter 8. So what does it mean here when Jeremiah talks about something growing, a shrub growing in the desert? Take the Advent and make it and all that surrounds it the shrub that's attempting to grow in our desert. One thing is we make ourselves our own strength. All of us do. We talked about it a little in Sunday school. Every person in this room raises their children to be what? Self-sufficient. I mean, it's just the right thing to do, right? You want them to be self-sufficient. You want them to leave the house. You want them to not come back. You want them to just go and live their own life. But you know, there's a friction there if you're a believer. Nobody's self-sufficient. None of us remember talking to somebody once here in this church about all that they had earned. And they were talking about a member of their family who was not interested in going out and earning anything. And if they could just get out like I did and earn what they have, then they could have nice things too. I understand what the person meant. But the only reason the person who had earned those things could earn them was because that person had a body that worked and a mind that worked and limbs that worked. I mean, let's talk to Cody right now with one of his arms not working. How self-sufficient does he feel right at this moment? So none of us are self-sufficient. None of us. Every one of us depends ultimately on God. My sufficiency that I have is not mine if I'm thinking about it rationally. God gave it. Whatever gifts we have, he gives those to us. We're just born with them. We don't ask for them. And ultimately, Jesus has paid for me to be here as a believer. So you've got these promises in the Bible, prophetic promises. Isaiah 7, a woman, a young maiden, it says actually, and I want to settle this argument for you. Some of you may be familiar with it, you may not. There's a huge argument going on in theology now for about 20 years. The Hebrew in Isaiah says a young maiden. And so there are people who say, see here, it's not talking about a virgin. It's talking about just a young woman. What they don't understand is, in the Hebrew tradition, in that century of reality, the 700s BC, when you used that term, you meant a woman who had never been with a man. Same thing, right? So here it all starts to happen. You've got these prophecies, and you've got a lot of people in Judea who know the prophecies. They're really looking for Messiah. The problem is there's been a dozen of them before Jesus. There have been a dozen people who said, I'm the one. Well, the Romans dealt with all of them, like they always deal with people like this. But then you've got Mary and Joseph. They're of proper lineage. You can look back in Mary's lineage and Joseph's lineage, and both of them are of the proper lineage for them to be the parents of the Jewish Messiah. The timing is right. Everything has lined up here. And but the problem was the Jewish intelligentsia didn't know what the Messiah was to really be. They thought, here's coming King David once again, and he's going to drive the Romans out. We're going to be an independent nation once again. None of this that we're suffering right now under the Roman Empire is going to be, because he's going to end it. That's what they thought. And what had happened to the Jewish nation by this time in history, they had been the oracle of God to the world for so long. The priesthood had been around for so long, 1,400 years, until now it was just a gig. It was a gig. It was what they did. Think of this, to give you a perspective on this for us here today. Think of this. All right, let's say that one of these people we're praying for, we pray for them at 11:29, and one of you get a phone call for one of these people's relatives that we're praying for, and they say, did you know so-and-so was just healed? They say, what time was it? 11:29. Well, we would think, what? God's done a miracle, right? I promise you there are lots of people who would say, well, these things just happen. Medically, they just happen. Scientifically, they just happen. That's the distinction. All of these things lined up for those in Judea, biblically and supernaturally, but everything now has just become a gig. It's all just a secular thing that we're doing. It's a festival. It's no longer got the impact of the supernatural. If you don't think that's true, think about what Jesus encountered. What did he do? He came into the temple, and what were they doing? They were changing money and making a profit on the backs of poor people who had to come and spend temple money to buy their sacrifice. It was a gig. It was a business opportunity. That's all it was. So the Jews at this time in history, in many respects, were just as jaded as we are. Life goes on. You get up, you do your gig, you come home. The next day you do the same thing. You look forward to the weekend, whatever that is. The Jewish leaders at that time looked at Jesus as Messiah, and they said, this doesn't look right to us. It's not what we expected. So why did it have to happen this way? That's a big question for me. I remember we traveled many years ago with an evangelist from England. And I never forget this. He would talk about the gospel and the Advent, and he said, it's a crazy plan. I think it is a crazy plan. It's just crazy. I mean, God Almighty comes into the world as a helpless baby. What kind of plan is that? Then he has to grow up, right? He doesn't know that 8 times 8 is 64 at some point in his life. But think about it in the opposite way. Let's say that God just blasted into humanity as himself. Well, yeah, we'd believe he was there, but would anybody really like it? I don't think so. I think we would say, what an effrontery that this being should blast into my life in this way when I was doing just fine without him all this time. I have tremendous sympathy for the Jews at this time in history, because I'm going to say Rip Snow would have missed it too. I would have missed it. The Advent would have just come and gone, and I would have thought, wow, that's kind of neat. And I would have moved on with my life, not thinking that this is the person who's come to save us all from sin. I mean, we do this, don't we? We come and we hear sermons, we read books, we read our Bible, and a lot of times we don't make the connections for ourselves. So why should we be surprised that at the time when Jesus' Advent took place, they didn't make the connections? I wouldn't have made them. Sunday is something we just do. For them, Saturday was something they just did. He didn't have to come this way, but he chose to come this way, and he came this way for very, very, very good reasons. First of all, I saw an article about 5 years ago where a person wrote this blog that said, Jesus only gave up a weekend for you and me. That the whole of the crucifixion, which all took place over a weekend, he gave up a weekend for you and me. Is that really a big deal? Now, I just look at that and I say, you know, you don't have a clue what crucifixion is. You don't have a clue what it is to get the 39 lashes with the cat o' nine tails after you've been stripped down to nothing. But you see, God came this way in the helplessness of a baby so that we couldn't turn back to God and say, oh, well, it's God after all. No big deal for him. That was the argument of it was just a weekend for Jesus. That was the argument. Well, it's Jesus of Nazareth after all. You see, the gap between you and me and God can only be bridged by God entering into humanity himself and becoming a helpless baby to come underneath us. The life change for us is that the dry ground is only going to be pierced by God identifying with you and me. That's why the Advent had to be as it was. And now think of it like this. Think. You and I go through stuff. We're praying for a bunch of people who are going through things right now. God can allow that to happen and harness that in our lives to change us into the people he'd have us be, because he suffered too. It's not just God standing back coolly as the maker of the universe and all of his power and glory saying, well, sorry you're going through it. I'll try to help you. No, he knows exactly what it's like to suffer. He knows what it's like. So we don't bear anything that Jesus, God, didn't suffer himself. He identifies with it. I can respect that. Doesn't that seem more respectable? Doesn't that seem like something where we can look at God and say, this upside down gospel that we've got has a good reason for being so upside down? Because now nobody can stand back from God and say, oh, well, that's fine for you. You're God. You don't know how it is. He does know how it is. He's been one of us. He knows exactly how it is. It's one thing to say that God, because he's God, right? He's really smart. He made us. That he knows because he made us. It's a lot more powerful thing and a lot more penetrating thing to say he knows because he's been one of us at Advent. That's why the Advent is the way it is. That's why God chose this way, so that he could identify with us. Everything we go through, everything we ever face, we have faced nothing that he himself has not faced in being one of us. I don't know where everybody is today.